Good morning and good afternoon, everyone. I am Avinash, and I've worked with Jim on Foresight for Food. We have split this presentation in two parts. I'm going to talk about the big picture, as you would see in the agenda, and then Jim will talk more about the foresight processes, new developments in it, and what we expect to do. So one caveat before I start talking on the substance is that. I was asked to cover the big picture, and there's always a challenge when you are trying to present the big picture is that you will miss big parts of that picture whenever you are presenting it. There's always a selection bias, and I did miss, I deliberately or inadvertently will not be presenting some of the big aspects of the big picture of the food systems. For example, on the institutions, some of it is deliberate because I know later Lynn will talk about institutional arrangements, etc. So I'll just get started with it. So if you look at sustainable, what do we want from food systems? One framing that is there available to us is SDGs, and we know that EGP has a high density of rural poverty and undernutrition, and that's where it is going to be critical to achievement of almost all of the food system goals. EGP, one big picture thing is there's a sharp drop, except in Bihar, in population growth, and now the working population is growing much faster than the dependent population, which requires creating jobs. And we know that in this region, agriculture is a big source of job. One thing, which is a good thing that has happened in recent times, is that labor productivity in rice wheat system, which dominates the region, at least in area terms, has doubled. And the amount of labor generated or required to cultivate 1 hectare of field is much lower now than, let's say, it was 20 years ago, which means, but wage rate haven't doubled with increase in labor productivity. So which creates its own challenge of job creation, and I think is one of the biggest challenges that dominates the policy discussion in another critical feature of this region is really small holdings like Bihar, West Bengal, Bangladesh. We don't have that kind of a split data for Bangladesh, but you would have seen nearly half of the fields are less than 500 square meters in size, and small holdings. Is by itself not wouldn't be a problem, but there's another problem that these farmers, this is consumption expenditure from a nationwide survey in India by NABARD, shows that most of these farmers, smallholders, are quite poor. They live in utter poverty actually, unless your poverty line is super mean. There's another challenge. Poverty is one. The other is that these farmers have very low purchasing power and very small marketable surpluses, which creates, as a result, they face very high transactions costs and low bargaining power, both in input and output markets. It's not only a challenge for these farmers to disempower them, it's also a challenge for the businesses that want to connect to these farmers and serve them, and government when it tries to reach out to you have to reach out to these millions of farmers who have very limited financial capacity and other capacity. So it's an institutional challenge for the food systems in this region. Digital technology can help, but it hasn't completely solved this problem, and we need to come up with solutions for that. Sorry. Uh, so an ongoing thing, and I'm going away from agriculture for a bit here, is that the gap between farm and non-farm income in all three countries is rising. As the economy has like moved away from agriculture in value creation, in job creation, agriculture still is the main, so is a big source. So there are a lot of people engaged in farming. This is a quote for India, but applies equally to Bangladesh and Nepal also, but it generates very little. And as a result, all farm households, most farm households, I shouldn't say all farm households, have to enter into other occupations too. It has become quite common in recent data. And as a result, rural economies are not essentially agricultural economies. And that creates its own set of opportunities and challenges. And this, like I said, even the most of these farmers do not earn even as the lowest rank official or worker in a government job, which is like the basic that you would want to achieve for a decent living. This inequality has implications for policy and how policy responds to it. Inequality creates disaffection. The way political leaders respond, they cannot engineer the whole structural change. is they respond with populist subsidies of all kinds, which may even make the problem worse. And these subsidies do not reach equally to everyone. They often end up reaching people, farmers, groups of farmers who mobilize to demand them. This could be certain geographies or certain classes of farmers, not the ones who need them the most. And this is a big challenge for the big feature of the superstructure or this agriculture policy world, agriculture and food policy world in the entire region. Uh, uh, and as what it's not that farmers are just sitting and demanding subsidy, and that's the only thing they're doing. One of the big responses that you are seeing by farmers is they are diversifying occupationally and where they work and what they work on. So for marginal farmers, again, from this NABARD data, it shows, and even BHS data in Bangladesh shows that wage income, ag and other non-ag wage income exceeds their income from crops and animal husbandry. So they're doing that. A second response to this challenge is that the men are migrating. Women are not migrating as much because of various reasons. And as a result, this is the migration is most intense from Nepal, where almost a quarter of country's net domestic product comes from remittances, but is high in Bihar too. And even Bengal and Bangladesh, which used to be for centuries with a net recipient of migrants, are now net source of immigration to other parts of or the region or even the world. The challenge with migration and occupational diversification is that farmers, small farmers and farm laborers who are moving out of agriculture rely on precarious sources of income. The jobs outside of agriculture are not all that great. Very few of them now work as agricultural laborers in other parts of the region. Most of them are in manual labor, informal jobs, small enterprises, etc. The other aspect of this is that as a result, there is, especially in Bihar and Nepal, Tarai, you have a lot of households where like de facto women-headed households, though not de jure, and we do not understand. I think there's, especially economists haven't done a lot of work, but even in other disciplines, there's a limited understanding of how all the positive and negative effects of it on the society, on the children, on the women themselves who are left behind, plus also the men who live for months and years away from their families. And I think that's affecting how the society is changing in rural EGP. One thing that we keep hoping for, that the land, because these holdings are so small, so land will be consolidated, and as a result would become more productive, would be easier to deploy technologies, etc. But land consolidation is not happening here, either through legal processes, corporate takeover, etc., or through informal land leasing. It's very difficult. And then outside agriculture jobs, like I said, are also precarious. Corporate farms are unlikely. This is just not the Asian model. If you look at China and Vietnam, which do very well agriculturally, at least compared to EGP, they have smaller holdings, more farmers than this region has, and yet you do not see large scale corporate consolidation or even government-sponsored consolidation, though some consolidation has started in China. So what we need in this region, and I think this need remains, we have FPOs, etc., but we need better aggregation models, and we need to see how we can aggregate smallholders. There could be multiple models, and that experimentation needs to continue if we want to improve the lot of farmers, their bargaining power, and make it easier even to deploy technology or bring markets closer to farmers. So it's required for all three actors: farmers, governments, and investors. And we do not have any answer. FPOs, 90% of them fail. So we have to keep experimenting with what models would work where, or how could we make existing models more efficient. While men are leaving, you do see that women are dropping from the labor market, especially in Indian EGP. More recent data, we don't know how trustworthy they are, how credible they are. So even darker stark picture than what you see on the charts. Most recent data that I checked for my home state, Bihar, women labor force participation was reported at 4%. We need to check if it's really as low as it is. COVID, with men walking back to their homes, they have edged out or pushed out the few women who were working in agriculture and in other available jobs to women. Again, Sucharita, who has worked on STIP projects and done wonderful work on it, would tell you more about how we understand very little on women dropping out of labor force. It is by choice. Is it because jobs are not available? And what are its implications? We need more data. We need more engagement in any future work that we do, like why this is happening and what are its implications. But it's a big thing. While men are moving away, this is pre-COVID data, the wage gap, the discrimination against women remains very much there in agriculture, let's say, but there in other occupations too. It's more in some parts of the region than others, but it's there everywhere that women get paid less for the same job that they do compared to men. And it has not gone down. If you look at the gap is not narrowing, even as men were dropping out of the rural wage market. A good thing, though, I talked about agriculture, its limitations and challenges and the unknowns, is that the off-farm economy is growing much faster in the region than the farm economy. Agriculture across the region in last few years hasn't grown rapidly, even 4% per year growth. That the goal that governments often set for agriculture growth has not been consistently achieved. But off-farm enterprises or post-harvest enterprises have been growing both in number and in their contribution to the economy. Their growth rate is much faster, which is creating some job opportunities more for men than women, but for both. But if you look at the overall, this is the Indian numbers, but numbers are similar for Bangladesh and Nepal. You have a very large number of very small farmers linked by a huge number of one-person enterprises that are mostly in informal sector that connect these 150, 200 million farmers to a billion, 1.5 billion farmers. And there's a lot of churning and a lot of growth in this sector. But like COVID has underlined, let's say if you want to promote food safety, it creates limitations for the kind of approaches you can take to regulate and organize this sector. Purely legal approaches or even incentives and penalties are unlikely to work because we do not have the state capacity in the entire EGP region to regulate so small enterprises. Many of them are not even permanent enterprises. So we have to go through like communication approaches and raising awareness, consumer awareness, producer awareness, etc. Pure legal, pure stick and carrot approaches are unlikely to work in this region for the goals of health, sustainability, and etc. that we want to achieve. It's also challenge at both nodes actually. So when you're trying to aggregate produce from farmers to bring it to the market, there's a challenge there. And then given so many small enterprises, disaggregation, when they're trying to get the produce from wholesale markets to consumer, at both nodes you have these challenges, and it needs to rethink. We cannot copy approaches used by other richer countries to regulate our wet markets, etc. There is another major change that offers opportunities is that urbanization is happening rapidly in the area. Again, data are suspect, but we know that Bihar is one area and parts of Nepal where urbanization is one of the lowest in the world, probably the lowest. The rest of the region, especially the two Bengals, are rapidly urbanizing, and that creates a lot of opportunities for smallholders to capture, like earn a higher income by serving the urban consumers and promote innovation. Completely moving away from the organization of the value chain and the farmers. This region is a hotspot for climate change. I'm showing figures for India, but Bangladesh and Nepal are equally, if not even more vulnerable. The poverty in the region makes it the people here even more vulnerable. This is just one example on temperature, but every metric of climate change is worth. Combined with climate change, there is a problem of soil depletion. That is, organic low carbon is very low on the Indian part, and it's modest in Nepal and Bangladesh. Water quantity availability is less of a challenge, but its quality, especially in Bengals and some part of Bihar, with arsenic contamination, etc., are a problem. Air quality is another problem where agriculture also and cooking also contribute, but is generally not acknowledged. It's not measured, and that's why not acknowledged, but all satellite-based measures show very poor air quality in this region, even with such low industrialization. A loss of biodiversity is another issue that we do not talk. This area, most parts except Sundarbans are not recognized biodiversity hotspots, but even then monocropping, etc., are affecting biodiversity. And you see a lot of conversation on it in the fisheries, but not in other aspects of our food production system. So coming back, The two defining challenges, at least as I see, is one is overcoming the deep endemic poverty and then building resilience to climate change and creating a sustainable thing. The challenge is that if agriculture remains unsustainable and just as vulnerable to climate change as it is, it will destroy lives and livelihoods. It already is doing. On the other hand, if we adopt policies to control or to address these problems that affect farmers' income, that would not sell. In democratic polity, it would be very hard. We need to have both. The good thing is that there are many opportunities for double dividends, where if you are becoming more sustainable intensification or addressing climate change, vulnerability to climate change, that may even those strategies may even increase farmers' incomes, and those are the opportunities we need to identify and scale out. Most of our work in the SDLP has been based on production and what's happening on the farm and in the markets. But we do acknowledge the big challenge that the region faces is the nutrition. Markets are very, very poor. Our diets eat too much cereals and too little of everything else that human body needs to be for a healthy growth. And the problem is, while the recommended diet, we are far from recommended diet. One challenge in getting to the recommended diet is for most of South Asia, most people cannot afford the healthy plate. Let's say the Eat Lancet recommends, or even the National Dietary Recommendation recommends. So how to make two things. How to make this healthy plate affordable is one challenge. And second is how to grow it within the ecological, not the planetary boundaries, but the ecological boundaries of the region. Are those two challenges that we need to grapple with in any foresight for food work in this region. We are one CG is preparing a project in these three countries and Pakistan, precisely focused on that, on different aspects of that. And I can talk more about that project in time there for question answers. One thing that we talked very little about in our research, but did some work on under the SDIP project, is the mercantilist approach to food trade in the region. All countries, including science institutions, wants to maximize food exports, but would like to import nothing. That seems to be the policy ideal, as you will see from the discussion on edible oil imports in it. And if you compare even with our ASEAN neighbors, you'll see that we import and export much less food than let's say the ASEAN region. Our trade is far more closed. It's the least integrated economic bloc in the region, and that hurts both farmers and consumers. It also makes the Eat Lancet type planetary boundaries framing much less relevant, because if planetary boundaries would be relevant only if countries were freely trading food across borders. But that doesn't happen in the region and is unlikely to happen in the future. So how do we change the discourse on food trade? How do we make our countries, our policymakers, and even our science establishments more open to food? Food trade in itself is not bad. It can improve the availability of healthy food. It can also reduce the ecological pressure on food production. Too much rice being produced in Punjab and Haryana and all that. So that's one thing that is not being talked about. It's talked much more in ASEAN, much less in South Asia, and we need to talk more about food trade and how to open food trade in a way that helps farmers as well as consumers in the region. And any future project should include a trade component, in my view. A big question for food and agriculture in EGP is that how do we need for a healthy food plate, we need to have non-cereal foods more affordable. That requires agriculture diversification. A big problem is the high volatility in prices. Apart from production risk, the price risk. I'm doing research in Jharkhand. It shows that farmers that diversified actually ended up earning less than the farmers who didn't diversify in many years. So that remains a big challenge. And we have a project that's under approval with ACR, where we are going to explore what are the barriers to diversifying agriculture to high value activities, and what can be done about it. A challenge here.
Avinash, can you wrap up so we can leave Jim a bit of time?
Sure. So these are my last two slides. There's a big
Very good. Thank you.
Policy attention and the value. So already non-cereal produce contributes much more to the value of agriculture output in the region. But if you look at the share of the budget allocation on research and policy, it's much more on cereals, and that needs to change. Rice wheat agriculture, as I said, is neither profitable nor beyond a point, etc. So nutrition transition can occur as countries grow richer, but we need deliberate efforts. Pure GDP growth by itself would not bring the nutrition transitions. We have a number of opportunities in this region. We have challenges, but a number of opportunities to transform food systems to make it more inclusive and more sustainable. But what we need is to bring policy, evidence, and action on the ground together through evidence, along with empirical evidence. Thank you. Thanks a lot. Over to Jim. I will stop here.
Okay, we will listen to Jim, and then I will ask the reviewers to ask clarifying questions if they want for both presentation we've heard. But let's get the Foresight presentation now. So Jim, can you go ahead?
Right, I think you're hearing and seeing me, is that correct?
We are hearing you.
But not seeing me.
So Avinash should stop sharing and we'll be able to see you.
I'm trying to stop sharing. I'm not that familiar with the WebEx thing. Eric, can you do it for me?
Okay, I'll try. We can now see Jim on the. So Jim, go ahead, and I will.
Okay.
Do you have a screen to share?
No, I don't. I'll just speak and.
Very good. Go ahead.
Good morning, everybody. Lovely to connect again. And as Andrew and Tamara have mentioned, such a shame that we're not able to do this together. I've certainly really missed being able to catch up with people in the region over the last 18 months, but I hope everybody's doing well in the COVID context. I'll just say a few brief things around the broader thinking around the foresight and scenario work. And I think to some extent, the presentation you've just had from Avinash almost just says it all in its own right in terms of how do we really understand these huge dynamics that are happening across agriculture, food systems, climate, the environment, and what that means for the future. I think Andrew mentioned in the beginning about the need to be much more anticipatory in the decision-making and policy thinking that goes on. The whole notion of the foresight and scenario work is to try and support that more anticipatory work. I think it has two main elements to it, really. I mean, one is, given that these huge dynamics are happening in markets and climate and livelihoods, as Avinash has just so clearly articulated, how do we make sure that our future thinking isn't based on past false assumptions? And secondly, how do we become more attuned to what might be some of the big uncertainties and how we might respond to those different uncertainties? And I think that, again, the whole COVID situation of perhaps not being anything like as well prepared for something like that gives a very good illustration of why trying to be aware of some of the future uncertainties that pose risks are really important. So what we've really done with the foresight and scenario work is try to work with different groups at a national level and also at a local level to, in a participatory way, help people to think through what are the system dynamics we need to be thinking about, and then how do we take that longer term perspective of how big trends are changing, what the implications of those trends are for the interests and needs of different groups, and what might be some of the big uncertainties that different groups will have to cope with. And then pulling all that back together into supporting a decision-making framework and thinking more about the future. As everybody has mentioned, the whole process of doing that over the last 18 months has been severely hampered by COVID. I mean, you can do some of this work virtually, and of course, a lot of the background work around this that Avinash has just been presented has continued to go on, but some of the more local level work and bringing all of this together at a regional level that we've been hoping to do has just been completely hampered by the COVID situation. But I think what we have managed to do is develop a very sound example of why this sort of foresight and scenario thinking work is important, and in terms of a way with groups of people, the sort of systems thinking, the scenario methodologies, the sort of analysis. And I think a number of you have participated in a number of the workshops that we've had where we've gone through those sorts of processes. So I think that's probably all I need to say around the work in the region. I just wanted to connect this back to what's happening at a global level. And some years ago, ACIR invested in supporting a global initiative, Foresight for Food, on foresight and scenario work. And we've just received a €4 million grant from the Dutch, which is flowing through the International Fund for Agricultural Development, and that is going to support a broader global effort that's intended to help respond to the outcomes of the UN Food Systems Summit. But we're also looking at having more in-depth pilot projects over a 3-year period in countries in Africa, South Asia, and probably the Middle East. And so we're really looking forward to how we can connect the ongoing food systems transformation work in South Asia with this global initiative, and hopefully have a country that we can sort of link in with your work in a more detailed way. And we'll be looking at the opportunities of that over the coming months. And I've already been discussing how that might work with Avinash, as well as IFPRI will be one of the key partners in that. So I think that's probably all I need to say. Avinash, have I missed anything out that I should have said?
Thank you, Jim.
If we have time, then it will be better if you just listen from our other people here in the room. Thanks, Jim.
Thank you, Avinash and Jim. Can I ask Kate if there are some specific issues you would like to raise with either Kuhu and Tamara or Avinash and Jim at this stage? Okay, Christian, you have your hand up, so you go first.
First of all, I'm not sure Kate's online. She's been having problems with WebEx. She's dropped in and out. I'm not sure whether that's been
okay,
fixed.
I can see her now, so that's good.
Okay.
But go ahead.
Yeah, I'm back on. Thanks so much, Christian, and my apologies. Yeah, I've been in and out.
Thank you, Eric, and thanks to Kuhu and Tamara for your presentation, and likewise to Avinash and Jim. A lot of stuff that you've covered, which is probably symptomatic of the nature of SDAP2, which was compression, both in time and intensity. And so thanks for a lot of the information. I'll just preface, we would be delighted if we could receive a copy of your excellent slides. They will help us. Very hard to capture all of the density of information that you've provided. I do have some specific questions to both of those presentations. If I may, Kate, I'll jump in, and then maybe you can either augment or go down a different pathway. In terms of some of the framing and the presentations that we got from, and there were several presentations we got from Kuhu and sorry, I'm just organizing my papers. Kuhu and Tamara was, you know, a lot of the activities, and I guess a key thing that strikes me was, you know, when you're trying these new modes, there was a transition, obviously, from a more conventional ACL mode into a programmatic mode, and there's a lot of activity to, you know, create the linkages. And as a result of the multiple different activities and components, one thing that strikes me is there's a lot of information. So there's an incredible level of achievement in terms of producing at various levels in the big projects, in the smaller projects. And I guess the question I have is, and it might be early days, you know, we have to recognize that you haven't had the full term, and that certainly COVID has certainly materially affected you. But how in what way are you tracking, for instance, the way a lot of your products, and I'll take the synthesis reports and the foresight briefs or the status reports as an example. So the mere fact that you've produced them is great, that they're accessible is excellent, that you've run a whole range of events where you've shared the information. All of that in itself is important, but what interests me is to what degree are these products being taken up, considered, in what way are you tracking in how these products and outputs are actually influencing, you know, the policy domain at various levels, etc. So the question is, you know, in what way can you track how these different knowledge products are actually affecting or influencing and ultimately achieving impacts down the track?
I can have a go at answering that. Thanks, Christian, for that question. I think for a lot of the project outputs, it's still a little bit early, I guess. They've kind of, you know, particularly because of COVID, things have really just been coming to an end and being tidied up. So we're really just starting to get the bulk of those reports and things out. I think there's still work to do in terms of synthesizing those. So for example, the foresight work, we do have those status briefs, but in the current, and there is still one part of the foresight work that will be ongoing for another 6 months or so. One of the aims of that is to kind of condense that into a more, a synthesis report of food systems in the Eastern Gangetic Plains, because you're right, at the moment we have 20 reports and so I guess synthesizing those and then being very specific about so for the foresight, again, that would be having a regional foresight event and then inviting particular people. And for some of the other work in terms of groundwater, for example, we're just coming up with some key integrated messages and then thinking about who we target in that space as well. So I think, that's still an emerging, that's kind of still an ongoing piece of work, I think. Kuhu, I don't know.
Avinash wanted to comment further.
Sorry.
Go ahead.
Think, Christian and Kate, there's a lot of undone work. I have started to look at the integration of the information, and we will have to decide the targets, because it's most for the policymakers, it's going to be a different form of the information, and for the users, the next users, it's going to be in a different form. So we are still working on it, and probably we'll need to work alongside with the new project to do this and get it out. Since we are building on it, there are opportunities to share all that information in a format which different people understand.
Thank you, Kuhu. Jim has his hand up. So, Jim, do you want to say something briefly and then we move on to Kate?
Sure, a very good point, Christian. I mean, Avinash might also want to just add to this, but I think it just does speak to the challenges over the last 18 months. So in the foresight and scenario work, absolutely the whole intention was to go through a whole series of policy engagement processes, to have a very large regional gathering. Had strong support from the director of IFPRI in the region and a range of other organisations, and we were all set to try and organise that with the intention of trying to demonstrate the value of the foresight scenario work that had been done and build interest and momentum in that sort of effort being able to be carried on into the future. Unfortunately, the whole COVID situation has just completely undermined the capability and the intention for doing that. We then stepped back to the idea of a more virtual way of doing that. And then, of course, the crisis that affected India in particular over the last year meant that really we just recognised that people just didn't have the space to be able to sort of cope with this sort of area at the moment. So that's hence, as Kuhu has said, trying to take that forward into the future. I think we have a very good opportunity to try and link that into the outcomes of the Global Food System Summit. So I think now there's going to be a lot of interest in saying, okay, we've got all of these big messages out of the Global Food System Summit. Okay, now what do we do about it? So I think that might open a sort of a new window for really trying to demonstrate what the SDIP work has done and how that sort of thinking and work can be a really good sort of way of helping to maintain the momentum and put some of this stuff into practice.
So Eric, may I go, or should I just type my response in the chat?
No, that's all right. You can go. You can take 1 minute, and then we get Kate's question.
I've got a comment, Eric, so it's okay. So
go ahead, Kate. Go ahead, Kate.
No, you go.
Okay. So two things. One is, I think the 3 levels of impacts that has happened, as I realize, this was not as planned. I think to some extent, and Robin and others can comment on it, have even influenced the way ACI thinks about funding or supporting research in the region as a result of some of our work, not all of it. So that's one level of impact. The second is the way CG institutions and our partners in ICAR are talking about doing research here. So under the One CG project, there's a big project that is regional one. It's called TAFSA. I don't remember the full form, though I am one of the IDT teams. It's taking exactly that food systems perspective and bringing data and dialogue there's one entire package in that proposal. I don't know if it'll get funded or to what extent. It's called learning platforms, which is very similar to creating improved data sets and a continuous dialogue with different people to think about how to make a healthy plate affordable and sustainable. So influencing research, that was the easier part. The second is influencing governments or informing governments. And that in South Asia happens most of the time very informally, rather informally. And even when it happens formally, they do not acknowledge where did the idea come from, barring one or two cases when the researchers within the government are writing code. So tracking is, even in like one CG proposal, it's not going to acknowledge our four systems proposal as such or our work as such. So tracking is going to be a challenge. Right now, I am in a meeting called Wicked Sprint, where we are going to talk about food procurement policies in Government of India. And I'm going to present some of the work that we did in it. This is a 25 people, a bunch of government officials here. They'll take some of these ideas and probably use it or not use it. But I think that that remains a perpetual challenge because governments in the region tend to think that they know everything and they're doing everything, as Kaushik Basu wrote in his journal. So that would remain a challenge, especially for the biggest policy impact area that we are talking about, which is with the government. I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you, Kate. Sorry to have kept you waiting.
No, you haven't kept me waiting at all, Eric. Thank you. I mean, in a sense, my question was a very similar question to the one that Christian posed. So perhaps rather than going back down that, I just wanted to make a reflection on the foresighting component of the work. And both Christian and I have engaged and interviewed a number of different people. And I just think it's interesting to reflect just how positively the foresighting component has been received. And that notion of planning from the future, the anticipatory approach. I mean, there was some skepticism that people tabled in the course of the interviews, but there's been really positive feedback about the approach and the methodology of the approach. So, you know, we had, I'm just thinking, we spoke to a gentleman from Niti Aayog, and, you know, that methodology has had a level of influence and it's shifted a little bit of thinking about that. So I just wanted to table that. Then I just wanted to also perhaps comment rather than question, but to your point, Kuhu, something that's really struck the reviewers as we've been working through is, yeah, look, there's this enormous amount of information and knowledge being generated, and you know, that's so what question that Christian asked, where's it going, who's it influencing, how can we know that? There's something in here from an approach perspective is identifying the key policymakers and taking them on the journey. And I guess that's one of the questions we have. How much has that been done? So it's not great evidence looking for a home or a policy maker to influence. It's actually, you know, knowledge and evidence being generated in concert with policy interest and demand.
Thanks,
Thank
Kate.
you,
Much more
Kate.
articulate than I could have ever said it.